Hello, everyone, and welcome to Scaling and Securing Argo CD in the Enterprise. Today's webinar is sponsored by Harness and produced by Actual Tech Media. Speaking of Actual Tech Media, my name is Keith Ward. I'm with Actual Tech Media, and I am thrilled to be your moderator for what promises to be an extremely exciting event. But before we get to that main event, I do have to cover some housekeeping items for you today. All right, first off, we want this to be an informative event for you, so we encourage any and all questions in the questions box in your webinar control panel. At the end of today's presentation, we're going to have a dedicated Q&A session, so this is your chance to pick the brain of our expert. You should take advantage of it. Now, that Q&A panel is also the place to let us know about any technical issues you might be experiencing. A browser refresh is the first thing you want to do if you can't hear something or see something, if slides are not working, anything like that. Sometimes it takes a couple of browser refreshes. So if one refresh doesn't work, well, try another one. If that still doesn't work, let us know in that Q&A, and we will hop on there and provide you with further technical assistance. All right, next, check out the handout section. That is right there next to the Q&A tab. And that handout section is chock full of great resources for you, and they are all absolutely free. I'd especially like to call your attention today to a link for getting started with Harness. Check it out now. Now, in the handout section, you're also going to find a link to the ATM Decisions Group, which is a panel of IT decision makers that you can apply to join to participate in more in-depth events and other opportunities not available to mere mortals. All right, you will also find in that handout section a link to the ATM Event Center, which has our calendar of more upcoming events just like this one. All right. Third, one of you is going to leave today $250 richer thanks to the Amazon gift card we are giving away at the end. Now, you do have to be in attendance during the entire live event to qualify for the prize. The official terms and conditions of that prize drawing can be found in the handout section. Scroll to the bottom and you'll find the link with all the very boring, monotonous details right there. And finally, let's get back to questions. One of the best benefits of this and all Actual Tech Media events is the opportunity to ask questions of our expert presenters. And to help encourage those questions, we have a special additional prize for you today. That's another Amazon gift card, this one for $50 for the best question. Now, after the event is over, what we're going to do is look at all the questions that come in, pick out the very best one, and then contact that prize winner. And with that, folks, why don't we get to the good stuff? It is my pleasure to introduce you to our presenter today, and he is Mark Ram, Director of Product Management with Harness. Mark, I see that you are ready to go. Great to see you today.
Good to see you.
All right. So you look tan, rested, and ready, so I am going to hand you the ball so you can go ahead and run with it.
All right, well, let's get started. First, I'm going to talk a lot about scaling GitOps in the enterprise. There's three kind of buckets of things you could talk about here. You could talk about the cultural implications and process implications of how to scale, the technical side of scaling. And we're focusing here mostly on the technical side, but I have a lot of experience in all three sides. Before I was at Harness, I was at Weaveworks. So I've been doing GitOps for as long as it's been possible to be doing GitOps, really, since Weaveworks coined the term. We're going to talk a little bit about how to scale GitOps. I assume folks have some experience with GitOps. It seems like it is not changing. Has the slide changed for anyone else? All right, well, I'm going to keep chatting and try and figure out what is happening with the slides.
And Mark, I will try to help you out here too. We'll see what we can do, okay?
All right. So the term GitOps was coined by Weaveworks in 2017. I just want to level set on the sort of four core pieces of GitOps. One is that you have a declarative state that says how you want things to be deployed. The second is that you keep that state in an immutable okay, so there we go. All right, so we have the slides. So it has to be stored in an immutable record, and that should be versioned. And that's where the Git part comes in, is because Git is a great database for versioned immutable sets of text data. And then it needs to be pulled automatically and continuously reconciled against what's going on. The reason GitOps came to be was because we had a Terraform deployment where the actual state was not in the place where we had expected it for the Terraform plan, and caused outage. And so the very first version of GitOps was a bash script that just reapplied and checked the Terraform state against the actual state. And obviously has evolved quite a lot since then. The basics of GitOps is pretty well known these days. There's a versioned record of what you want deployed. Usually it's done with Kubernetes, so you're used to having manifest files, and instead of applying them directly to the cluster, you store them in Git, and an agent, a GitOps agent in the cluster or in another cluster that's managing it, will go and check the current state, check Git, make sure that they're the same, and if there's not, it has detected some drift, and it can either automatically fix that or send a message that that would need to be fixed. So we've basically already talked about this. I'm trying to go fairly quickly through this basics. Here are the sort of 6 areas of problems that people talk about when they're talking about how to scale GitOps. Often they're talking about slow performance. You get more than 1,000 to 2,000 applications in Argo CD. Deployments can be slowed down particularly. Sometimes slow deployments are caused by things happening on the repo server, and you can scale that up. There's various ways to solve these things, but that's the sort of first set. Another set is as you get larger and you have had to move to multiple GitOps agents in multiple clusters, figuring out how to allocate resources, scale that, how to deal with spikes, how to manage Argo CD at scale in particular is a set of questions people have. And as you scale to the enterprise level, another set of questions comes up, which is, how do I manage a bunch of different environments, and I want a progression across all of those different environments, all managed by GitOps, and I want that to be automated and integrated with Jira tickets and other things. So how do I manage promotion of new application versions into production in a more pipeline-like way? How do you deal with multiple clusters? How do you deal with security as you get larger and you get more instances? And how do you manage observability and troubleshooting as you get larger? And we'll dig into each of these. But if you have any particular interest in specific areas here, feel free to ask questions so that I know where to focus as we move along. So I wanted to zoom in a little bit on Argo CD scalability. I think that is most of the questions I get about GitOps scalability come down to, we want to do more with Argo, and how do we get Argo to scale to the level? There's reasons for this. Flux, I think the scalability model of Flux is a lot simpler. So I don't have nearly as many questions. So we're going to focus on this, although if you have Flux questions, feel free, again, to ask. I'm happy to talk about that too. The 3 main factors that affect how well your Argo CD will scale are the number of clusters that you manage, the number of applications that you manage, and the number of Git repositories that you have to connect to. Git repositories is the easiest one. You can horizontally scale the Argo CD repo server. So that just becomes, you need to add another instance and things go. But applications and clusters are more complex. They scale, say, 1,000 to 3,000, and then over 3,000, 5,000 will really struggle, and you're not going to get to 3,000 without doing some optimizations of what you track and how to manage Argo CD, and spend some significant time in the weeds of optimization there. Which results in the general advice of, if you want to grow your Argo CD estate, you're going to need multiple instances. And then that brings its own set of issues, but we'll talk about those more in a second. Just checking to see if there are any questions so far. All right. So now we'll talk about the other part of this, and it all will come together here in a second, is security. In order to scale your Argo CD use at the enterprise, you need to set up integrated security system, a way of thinking about how you secure your Argo CD instances, how that connects to your other instances, etc. So some advice for securing, especially as you move to the enterprise level: always use Argo CD projects. There's a default project in Argo CD that gives you open permissions. Always delete that project so that an app that is in the default project does not have permissions. And that forces every app to be in a project and use those projects. Argo CD provides that sort of security layer. Use it, but also use limited scope on your cluster roles. So if your cluster role does not need to do things in that cluster, don't give that cluster role binding permissions that it shouldn't have. And then if you're going to, and I highly recommend, store your GitOps configuration in Git, and we'll get to more on that later. But if you're going to store your RBAC or your Argo CD configuration in Git, always put that in a separate app, and always put that in a separate project that only admins have access to. That allows you to put RBAC in projects, store those project definitions in Git, and track changes around those things. And that is critical to maintaining a sort of security posture across the enterprise Argo CD deployment. And then sort of finally, make sure that there's RBAC on a Git repo. Like, you may want to have branch protections on the branch that controls production, etc. You may want to enforce code review, those sorts of permissions. On the code repo, ideally apply those permissions via Terraform or something, so that your code repo has declared permissions that make sense, that match what you expect. And do the same for your GitOps applications, for your projects, for all of the RBAC entities, so that those things can be versioned, changes to those things can be seen. And that just gives you an easy way to understand and validate that you have a RBAC that makes sense across all of your projects. There's some other things that I recommend, like create a secure pull request process. A thing that I think usually goes without saying, but doesn't go without saying, and often people forget, is never check in your secrets in Git, and find a way to use external secrets, use Vault, use some tool to provide secrets in the cluster so that you are not storing those things in Git. And again, here we have the issue of if we're going to namespace and enforce limited scope around Argo CD instances and control clusters and provide limited scope, it's going to indicate that you're probably going to want, for security reasons, to run multiple Argo CD instances. So my recommendation generally is that you find a way to automate your installation of your GitOps control plane, in this case, Argo CD. You can do that by, as I said earlier, using a declarative sort of control plane app, or not control plane, but an Argo CD configuration app that lets you configure your Argo CD from Git. And then you just, when you install a new cluster, install Argo, install this app, and then it becomes configured in the correct enterprise way, and you can track those configuration changes over time. Alternatively, you can do things like set it up from Terraform. Harness has a Terraform provider so that you can set up all of these things from Terraform. If you already have an infrastructure as code process and pipeline, it can just fit in more easily there. The other thing that fits in this general bucket of automate everything as you scale is that neither Argo CD nor Flux come with any sort of pipeline capability out of the box. And you need, if you're doing enterprise things, to integrate approval, integrate scanning for vulnerabilities in the images that you're going to deploy, etc. And you want to fit those things in a pipeline. And often GitOps users and enterprise GitOps deployments end up with each team sort of implementing this kind of pipeline by hand using GitHub Actions or something. However you do it, this process needs to be automated. There's emerging tools in the Argo CD community like Cargo that help a little bit with this, but they just help with the actual deployment. They don't have steps for all the things that you need to integrate. So there's various ways you can solve. Harness obviously has a pipeline product and a project that we integrate with GitOps so that you can integrate all of those sorts of steps. I believe I have missed a couple slide transitions there. Sorry about that. I think having a promotion pipeline of some kind is really important. It allows you to integrate your GitOps workflows with your other process. It allows you to automate change from one environment to another, which happens outside of that sort of GitOps application deployment loop. It allows you to have advanced multi-zone, multi-region deployment strategies that you can depend on what has happened in previous deployments, which is very difficult to do in a pure GitOps fashion without some sort of pipeline. And pipelines give you centralized visibility. You can see what changed, why. And I mean, honestly, I think in these days of DevOps, shouldn't have to argue very strongly that you should automate everything that you can automate. So all of this leads us to when you're deploying GitOps, there's various ways you can deploy the agents. When you're deploying Argo CD, you can have one instance of Argo and then set up clusters for every cluster that you need to manage resources in and scale that way. For small to medium-sized teams, this works great. You get the Argo UI, you get simple management process. You have one Argo CD instance to manage. You get Some cons you have, if there's a network disconnection between that sort of control cluster and any of the clusters, you can't deploy, which leads to the second most common use of Argo, which is that people run an instance of Argo in each cluster. This helps with scaling because often Argo scales plenty fine to fill up a Kubernetes cluster. And so Argo isn't the limitation there. On the other hand, this means now you have a different agent in each cluster, and critically for most folks, that means that dev, test, prod, etc. will be in different Argo instances and have different UIs, which can be a bit of a pain, which leads a lot of people to go to sort of an instance per logical group where you have a division or some sort of group that makes sense in your organization. And applications, projects don't move between groups very often. So it's easy to, and dev, test, prod would all be in the same group maybe, so that you can easily see them all from the single instance. Another option that people use is to use a tool like Harness or Acuity, where you can see across multiple agents what is going on in the cluster. So we've already talked about a few of the downsides here. You get multiple dashboards. Maybe you don't have metrics set up. The potential for one Argo CD to be set up in a slightly different way than the other can be problematic. And then related to the multiple dashboards, you have the multiple silos of information. So even if you're doing automation to figure out if all the instances of a particular service are up and functioning, you're going to have to query a number of different Argo instances to get that information. Sometimes this leads to more overhead. It very often leads to longer troubleshooting times, slower time to fix when you do have an incident, because it just takes longer to find the information that you need. Again, I'm going to go back to my earlier recommendation, which is to automate your GitOps infrastructure deployment, either with Terraform or using declarative configuration for your Argo and storing that in a centralized repo, so you have a clear record of what should be deployed and how Argo should be set up in each cluster. Another advantage of that is if you do have a recovery instance, you have reinstall, create a new cluster, install the Argo, and install the app that defines all your configuration. And if you are defining your application and projects there, it can go on and install all of the rest of the things that it was managing before and bring your whole system back up. So we already talked about one of the issues in scalability is that the stock Argo UI is per agent. We talked about the troubles that can cause in terms of debugging issues. And I mentioned earlier, there are options, commercial options, Harness, and also I think Acuity have a view that lets you see what's going on across all of your Argo instances. We're using open source Argo. They're using their own version. So there's a little difference there. But in the end, what you get is a centralized dashboard, which solves most of the problem with the horizontal scalability not being an option at the application level. So what do I think is going to happen in the future here in Argo CD and scalability? Well, there's one thing that I'd talk about quickly, which is I wish that upstream Argo would fix some of this and make it so that you can have a central Argo CD control plane that is not architecturally tied to the application controller deployment and the rest of the deployments, and make this more of a horizontally scalable system. I think that would just be an improvement to the Argo CD design. I think there's pent up desire for it, but I don't know if it'll happen. So I didn't put it in my list of things that I would say are trends in the future. I think we're going to have some better, some improvements around application set controllers. That's another sort of Argo CD sharding limitation, is that all applications in application set have to use the same agent. So if you are doing agent per cluster, you're not using Argo CD application sets. Better resource tracking. I think on the security side, OPA integration is going to continue to get better. I think Harness has continuous verification that we've tied to GitOps. I think that kind of trend is going to continue, with GitOps being tied to AI to do pull requests, validation, etc. I mean, those are the things we're working on. I expect others will work on those as well. Kubernetes or GitOps beyond Kubernetes. Harness has the infrastructure as code manager that provides GitOps for infrastructure as code deployments that are outside of Kubernetes. I expect more and more GitOps outside of Kubernetes to happen. And I mean, I think the momentum around Argo CD is continuing to grow. I think there'll be more plugins, more security plugins, etc. All right, so I think it is now time for questions and answers. Are there any questions?
Hey, Mark, thank you so much for that awesome presentation. Just great stuff there. And the topic you're talking about is just so crucial these days. I actually had a question of my own, if I can lead off with that. This is a particular interest to me. Kubernetes has been out, a long time now, relatively speaking. How mature would you say the technology is these days?
Well, in terms of usability and stability, I would say it's highly mature. Well, usability meaning, is it fit for use? Is it reliable? Does it work? I think the APIs are stable. Nothing is changing. I think it is overly complex in some ways. It fails to distinguish the things like network settings that are almost always environment specific from things like the basic configuration of the app that stay the same across environments. Just mixes all the config up into one bucket, or sets of unrelated items in different buckets to make it worse even. And that makes it difficult for it to really fit the needs of DevOps teams, where you have a diverse set of deployment environments. If you have very heterogeneous deployment environment that looks the same everywhere, Kubernetes can work, and you can make it work. But there's always this struggle of, it does not provide an abstraction at the sort of environment level that is helpful enough. And so then you have tools on it. Those tools are mature, but it's all a bit, I'm certainly not going to say it's not mature, and I'm not going to say it doesn't work. And we use it, and companies use it, and it works great. I think it's a huge evolution in how we do operations because of the declarative operations, because a deployment.yaml is a thing that you send to the server, and it enforces that state. It is a little robot that tries to make what you said in that true. I think that model of declarative operations is the way of the future. There's no way to scale. That's how goal-driven automation is how industrial automation scales to being able to do millions of instances of a thing with no defects, right? This is how you do it. This is how we manage this at scale in the industry where we've been doing scale that is, far more cars get made than, well, probably not anymore. Far more items get manufactured than instances of something get deployed in Kubernetes. And we have gotten better at manufacturing at scale in that way. And one of the lessons that we learned is declarative operation. So that, I think, will stick, and that will always, maybe not always, but they'll be around for a long time. And I think Kubernetes is the default way to do relatively homogeneous deployment environment across clouds. And I think there is a real value in having some API that is not controlled by a single vendor that you are using. And so I think Kubernetes has a place. I think Kubernetes does what it needs to do. It's missing any kind of change version management, change management. Right. And I think that's where GitOps comes in, is because change management is a thing developers and operators know about and do all the time with source code. And so using Git for change management of files, and then the fact that those can be just applied in Kubernetes, makes it all very straightforward to do in this context.
Right. Excellent. So if I were to summarize all that, I would say maybe that Kubernetes has come a long way, but there's still lots of room for improvement, right? So that's a really thorough explanation. I loved it, Mark. So let me ask another question that we just came in from Paul. He wants to know, can Harness help with maintaining the immutability of manifests in Argo CD?
Yeah, so I mean, we can help. So let me read this again. I've lost that question now.
Okay, well, let me read it out to you again then. Can Harness help with maintaining the immutability of manifests in Argo CD?
Well, so this is very much dependent on your Git configuration. If you don't allow rewrites of history, Git by default will have an immutable manifest. If you want to have better control of that, you can put your Git repo that is the source of truth in a write-only file system where, or not write-only, but no delete allowed file system, so that you can't, no one could even go into the file system and delete it, and it would be completely immutable. So Git really handles most of the immutability for it, but you do have to make sure that Git is configured properly, because people often allow history to be rewritten so that they can clean up the commit history on a branch before pulling it in, and you absolutely cannot allow that on production branches that you're depending on immutability. And
100%. No, yeah, absolutely. Okay. Another question for you. What are the most effective strategies? This is I'm going to give this to you in two parts, although it came in as one question, but I'll ask you one at a time. What are the most effective strategies for managing Argo CD deployments across multiple clusters?
So I think generally we use two strategies, but basically is the same system. You have your configuration that is your default configuration across all your clusters, stored somewhere, either in a Helm chart that defines the GitOps deployment, or set of manifests and a customization. And then for each environment, you have a customization or a separate values file that says what should be different in each. And then very often what we do, and what I see probably most common, is a sort of hub and spoke model where there's a central GitOps agent installed in some management cluster that installs the agent into has a connector to the managed cluster, installs an agent in there, and then that agent manages GitOps in that cluster, but has been installed and then can be upgraded by making changes to the config in Git.
Okay. So, second part of that, those methods that you just described here, hub and spoke, etc., how can these be automated to maintain performance and reliability?
Well, so that's really where sort of automating your GitOps platform comes in, and that is a recommendation that I make all the time, is to automate the install of the GitOps agent and the creation of the GitOps entities, the applications, projects, the entities that run your GitOps system. Store those in Git as well, so that when you need to recreate a system, you can recreate from the record in Git, and you have the same sort of benefits that GitOps gives for application deployment here at the like GitOps configuration management layer. And I think it's really important to here use something like Customize or Helm to separate the configuration that is common across all of your deployments from the configuration that is specific to an environment. And then Argo has native support for both of those things. So you just separate out the environment specific config for each one. And that way you have a very easy way of tracking change. Here are changes that is going to affect everything. Here are changes that affect only one environment.
It's important to to separate those out too. Okay. Now, next question. Now, you talked a good bit about security, and someone was kind of a little bit deeper dive into some of the basics. What are the key security considerations when setting up Argo CD in an enterprise environment? There you go.
So I think the number one thing that I would say is don't put all of your applications in the default Argo project, which also has permission to change Argo entities in the Argo namespace, so then can create new applications, new projects. That means that any application can make changes to the whole system. That is, don't do. So
in technical terms, that's called really bad, right?
Yes. So don't do that. Use Argo CD projects for each application that you deploy. Install it into a project. If you want network resilience in deployments, use on cluster agent. If you have other sort of performance networking concerns, you may choose a different architecture, but choose the right architecture. And that leads into the next 2 points I'll make, which is limit access in the management cluster of Argo CD to that cluster. Only use the namespace Argo CD so that you don't get Argo CD escalating to make other changes in a management cluster. And then use limited remote cluster roles. So if you're connecting to a remote cluster, only give that Kubernetes role the permissions that you need to deploy the things that you're deploying with that Argo connector. So you're doing security sort of at the Argo layer and then again at the Kubernetes layer. But that sort of layered approach is very helpful here. And make sure that the control plane, all the Argo instances are managed by a separate app in a separate project, and do not give everyone permission to that, because that's root basically. And then the last one that I push is automate setting up GitOps repository permissions, setting up branch protections, those sorts of things, alongside the creation of the applications that are deployed from those repos and the projects that define what you can do in those applications, so that all three of those things can have the same backend source of truth. Always try to automate those three things. And then if you can, use GitOps principles, reapply them on a regular basis, see if there's drift, so that you can know that your RBAC is configured the way that you think that it is configured. Because that is often the biggest security vulnerability I see, is that somebody misconfigured some RBAC and you don't know that there's a vulnerability until you find it. This is very common. So having automation here, having drift detection here is really helpful.
It's important to remember also, I think, Mark, that the bad guys are out there and attacks are getting more and more automated. They're using automation, so you really need to be using it to fight what they're doing as well. No doubt about it. Okay, got time for, I think, a couple more here. This has been a lot of fun. So another question for you. Does Harness offer automated or even AI-assisted tools or processes to assist with deployment quality checks? So after you've deployed, how do you check that the deployment is in good shape, basically?
So we have a feature in Harness that's called continuous validation that will look at the metrics before and after deployment. And it uses not generative AI, but sort of traditional AI techniques, machine learning algorithms, to look at historical metrics data versus the metrics around a deployment and figure out if there has been an issue. So this is a zero config sort of. We look at the state of good deployments and the state of bad deployments and tell you that this one looks bad. And so you can configure that into your GitOps and do automatic rollbacks if the service is not operating as expected post deployment. We are working on more of the sort of front end of checking configuration before it gets to the cluster. There's work to be done on that, but we are absolutely working on this. This is a thing where you want to get it right. You don't want to have even a 5% false, oh, this is bad code, because that's going to get people ignoring the whole system. It takes a while to get, and honestly, like, the tools are getting better every day. It's going to happen. We're going to have great systems, and we are working on those things.
Okay, great.
And then pull request is another area where I expect to see AI come in as a sort of gate to help you determine around configuration. Like, does it make sense? Is this configuration likely to be good? Seems like there could be a code review there.
So stay tuned for more. I mean, that sounds like a great use for AI. Okay, a couple of questions now, and then we're going to be done here for today. This is a question that comes up so often when you're talking about Kubernetes and CI/CD and these pipelines and all of that. What is the learning curve like for Argo CD?
Well, I mean, I think on one level, Argo CD is very simple. It takes a config file in Git and applies it to the cluster. Or maybe it uses Helm or Customize to adjust it a little bit before it applies it to the customer, but it taking a config file and applying it to the cluster. And there's some settings. So the basics of how to use Argo CD for an everyday application developer, very quick. On the other hand, Argo CD has no layer of abstraction over Kubernetes. So if you don't know Kubernetes already, there's a learning curve to Argo CD because it requires some Kubernetes understanding. And I mean, that's my main objection. I think there's this failure to separate environment config from application config, things like that, that make it a little harder. But my main concern about Kubernetes is the learning curve. Is just that is where the learning curve for Argo CD is. Beyond that, there's very minimal to figure out how to use Argo or Flux.
And that applies to pretty much any product you could buy in this space. You're right that learning Kubernetes is not a simple or easy thing, but it is just so worth it these days. If you want to have quick development cycles.
Every customer uses it. Everyone is trying to scale their Kubernetes deployments. It is the main tool being used in this space for a reason. It gives you freedom, it gives you flexibility, and it is good enough. Yeah, and that's what you want.
It's won the container wars. Really, it's just as simple as that. It has won the wars, and so that's what you need to be learning for sure. Okay, so finally, Mark, I think you've generated so much interest today in what Harness is doing. So someone who's watching today, if they want to get started with Harness or to find out more, what do you recommend they do as the very next step after this webinar ends?
Well, I mean, you can go on to Harness and sign up for a free test account and test some things out, or reach out to us. And if you have any questions, send questions to me. I would be happy to talk to you about any of these topics in more detail. If you're really working on scaling GitOps, I'm always seeking to learn what people are doing, what is happening. So whether or not you think Harness is exactly the right, I would love to chat about what you're doing and try and convince you that Harness is the right partner for you in this space.
but at heart, you're a geek and you love to talk geek with people, right? So
indeed,
that's what it matters. All right. Well, Mark, thank you so much for putting together a great presentation, for all of your insights in the Q&A, and for the education that I got. I thank you personally for that. I learned so much from you today, and I think the attendees did as well. We really appreciate your time. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
And with that, folks, we are nearly wrapped today. We just have one more piece of business to take care of, and that is the Amazon gift card prize drawing. As I mentioned at the beginning, you do have to be present during the entire event to be eligible to win. And we do have a winner for today, and that winner of the $250 is Ian Shelley from Washington. Congratulations to you, Ian. We will be in touch ASAP to get you your card. And with that, folks, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank Harness and Mark for making this event possible. I enjoyed it so very much. I want to thank you, attendees, for being here with us, for your interest in the topic, for your great questions, and I look forward to seeing you in the next event. That's a wrap for us today, folks. Have a great rest of your day.